Resident Evil 4's main release has nearly the exact same performance and graphics as the demo version. The game is a known quantity at this point for all the good and bad. The good aspects are that the PC version can be better than consoles with performance, or things like hair rendering and textures being obviously higher quality than they are found there on the consoles. But it is also bad for PC, as the same quirks and issues that I found in the demo are here in the final product and are unchanged. With that in mind, today's video covering the PC version is going to be straight to the point, optimized settings, and some information for you how to avoid as many of the technical issues as possible, as this game has a few of them, and you can really start to notice them just in the game's menu. The menu in Resident Evil 4 Remake is indeed better than it has been in past games. It controls better in my experience with a keyboard, and there are a lot more options to tweak, but honestly, I immediately also see issues here. For one, the resolution option still does that dumb thing where it immediately changes your resolution after your mouse cursor leaves the selection box. This is really bad user experience. Another bad user experience can be found in the options themselves not being tweakable in real time always. When you're in gameplay, going to the graphical options menu shows a number of settings that are key to performance that cannot be changed while playing the game. This is a big detriment in getting good optimized settings, as I find the preview hints about performance not enough in this title, but more on that later. Another issue with the graphical options is a long-standing one for RE Engine games, and that is image quality. Just like the demo and nearly every other RE Engine game released in the last 5 years, image quality on PC is not very good. TAA essentially does not seem to apply very well, and the game also has an untweakable sharpening filter that is forced at all times. With the camera sitting still, you can see things like vegetation crawling and edges shimmering incessantly, on top of having a kind of posterized look due to all the extra sharpening. Interlaced mode, as a result, is completely unusable, as it looks incredibly awful due to an overbearing sharpening there, and the TAA even applying worse. Basically, it looks like there's no anti-aliasing at all when you turn on the interlacing mode, so it's completely unusable. Unfortunately, the other options that they have added in this port do nothing to help the situation. FSR 1 is obviously even worse than native because you are sharpening and upscaling an already over-sharpened and poorly anti-aliased image. But FSR 2's inclusion here confuses me the most, as I've seen so much better results from FSR 2 in other games. It's really soft here in Resident Evil 4 Remake, in a way that FSR 2 generally never tends to be. Also, it's kind of shimmery and missing some anti-aliasing in areas I would have expected to be anti-aliasing better. I find it hard to recommend FSR 2 in this game beyond any resolution that is not 4K. This is disappointing, as the PC community and Digital Foundry have been trying to tell Capcom for years now that their anti-aliasing is broken and that the game is over-sharpened on PC. It's reached the point that the community now has made an RE framework mod to inject things like DLSS into the game to improve the situation. Just check out here how a completely hacked in DLSS looks much better than the native resolution for anti-aliasing coverage, while not being completely over-sharpened at the same time. It's so much more stable. It's also not weirdly soft and smeared looking like the native FSR 2 implementation found here. I don't think a user should have to download a mod to improve image quality to this point, nor should they have to resort to creating this mod in the first place to have DLSS or something like XeSS in-game. A AAA game launching in 2023 having FSR 2 but not having DLSS is just bad form to me. So my image quality recommendations are going to say use native resolution if you can, or download the DLSS mod. Although that mod is not perfect, as this is not a native implementation, so you can see issues such as a jittering and low-res HUD that can smear when the camera moves, and occasional specular highlights that will flare up in a weird way. So the mod is not a complete fix for something that Capcom should really natively support, but I still found it compelling enough in comparison to the alternatives, so that I used it for the second part of my gameplay capture, where I switched from native 1440p with TAA to 4K DLSS in performance mode, which technically ran a great deal better while also looking a great deal better. Coming to optimized settings here, a big part of them is avoiding crashing. Yeah, as bad as that sounds, I have read a lot of social media posts about this game crashing, and the assumption is that it has to do with GPU memory or VRAM usage, and in my experience, that appears to be the case, although it must be said people have reported crashing on GPUs like the RTX 4090, which realistically should not have VRAM issues. Like I said though, I have reproduced the issue, and specifically on 8 and 10 gigabyte GPUs. We can see it happening here when I played the game at high 2 gigabyte GPU texture settings at 1440p RT and otherwise max settings, and when I started the game, a few seconds into starting the campaign cinematic, it just crashed. The issue is solvable though, as I found out very quickly just by turning down the shadow resolution quality from max to high the next time I booted the game, and then the game just ran fine afterwards with no crashing. But I'll have some more specifics on how to avoid crashing in just a second. Before I talk about that, I need to say how bad of a user experience this is. As a rule, a game should not crash when it runs just out of VRAM, typically. You should instead expect it to slow down as it pages into system memory. Nearly every other DX12 or Vulkan game will do this, and I've covered this behavior in many videos before. So crashing is not a good thing. The crashing is doubly bad, I think, in Resident Evil 2 because it requires quite a lot of investigation to find out why it may be occurring, as the graphical options menu is not transparent enough as to what the issue possibly is. Yes, there is a VRAM measurement indicator there, but its readout only seems to indicate whether your game will crash when you have ray tracing set to on. In my experience, on an 8GB GPU, I could replicate crashing in a completely repeatable way with ray tracing set to high or normal with the texture memory cache set to 3, 4, 6, or 8GB, and or if shadow resolution was set to max. So the game would run fine with RT on when using the 2GB texture setting at 1440p on that 8GB 2070 Super. When set to 3, 4, 6, or 8GB, it was pretty obvious to see the VRAM allocation in the game menu was showing that things would be problematic. An RTX 3080 at 4K and my optimized settings with RT on would crash rather repeatedly if the textures were set to anything other than 3GB or lower. For the RTX 3080, the in-game VRAM indicator here was in the red zone in those moments when I could reproduce crashes. But that is only with ray tracing on. Technically, you can be in the red zone with ray tracing off and just never ever have a crash. So there is some consistency to the crashing. And luckily for you in the audience, my optimized settings sidestep any crashing by just not using the maxed settings for things like texture, shadows, and reflections, which seem to be causing the issue in their combination. So the first optimized settings thing to do is turn off ray tracing. RE Engine games generally have not the greatest ray tracing. Their quality is one that is targeting console performance levels, and it really shows. Just check out the ray tracing here at high and 1440p. Notice all that extra aliasing that is added into the image due to ray tracing being on and its internal resolution being pretty low. RT, I think, makes this scene look worse here, and it also runs worse. Same in this scene here by the water. Just look at all those chunky pixels in the reflection on the water surface that are smearing around. Basically, Capcom's ray traced reflections in this game are too compromised in quality to be game-changing enough to make their performance cost worth it for people using mid-range GPUs. Turn them off for optimized settings. The same applies to the game's screen space reflections. Much like RT reflections, RE Engine's SSR is just not good, yet it costs a lot. Look at how much added flickering and aliasing there is in this image with SSR on here, for example. Really, turn off screen space reflections for optimized settings. Another optimization is to find out what texture quality setting you should use, and this is a really tricky one. For one, the texture quality setting is not consistent in how it performs. Let me show you what I mean. When I set the game to 1440p, I found out that the streaming cache, when set to 4GB on the 8GB GPU, would show rather low texture quality on some scattered world objects. Like the floor here stays ultra high res at the 4GB setting, but the rags on the floor lose texture quality in a substantial way. As a small aside here, I find this texture behavior really strange, as it's quite different from what the consoles do. As you can see, compared to PS5, you can see that the consoles have every texture in the scene be lower quality in a uniform way. The floor is lower quality than the PC's highest setting here, but so are the scattered rags on the ground, in a uniform way. On PC, when texture quality degrades, it never goes down to this lower quality as found on consoles. Instead, it it piecemeal goes down to a shockingly lower quality. It would appear that consoles limit their texture MIP quality for every texture in a uniform way, which is sensible. So why is this not an option on PC? But I digress. As my testing is showing here in the previous example, there appears to be some consistency on the surface level of how the texture cache setting might be working. That's what I thought, but in reality, the texture setting is not consistent at all. When I changed the internal resolution and tested texture quality again, I found suddenly that at a higher output resolution of 4K interlacing, the 4GB setting would produce higher texture quality than that same 4GB setting at 1440p. Huh? What? This is really confusing, right? Well, I tried another combination of 1440p and DLSS quality mode with ray tracing turned on, and even there, the 3GB texture cache setting was higher quality than the 4GB setting at 1440p native. I just don't understand how the texture cache setting works in this game. The one important thing I found out about it is that the game will not crash on an 8GB GPU even when the texture cache setting is set to 8GB at 1440p as long as ray tracing is set to off. Same with a 10GB card at 4K. So as I see it, optimized settings here are textures set to 8GB unless you have ray tracing set to on. The other optimized settings I have are the same I have made for other Resident Evil games, with one difference. So firstly, reduce the volumetric lighting quality to high. This will save around 8% performance in a scene like this one, while looking pretty much identical. The shadow cache setting. This adds a bit more VRAM utilization in the scenes where it is active, but it does not affect visual quality. Turning it on can improve performance by just under 10% in indoor scenes like this one. The second to last optimized setting really is to turn down the shadow quality from high to max, and the reason to do this is purely for VRAM related reasons on a mid-range GPU. It performs nearly the exact same between the settings, but it does add a hefty amount of VRAM utilized as we can see here. This means competition for texture quality perhaps, and we don't want that. The last optimized setting is in the ambient occlusion setting. Here you really want to use AMD Fidelity Effects CACAO option as it is found on PC. It gives much more subtle and less gamey looking indirect shadow coverage than the game's standard SSAO. Like here on this lantern on the wall. The standard SSAO has a screen space shadow right next to the really bright lamp, which makes no physical sense at all. This more realistic shadowing is found throughout all scenes in a subtle way usually, but outdoors at times at night like we see here, we can see how the normal SSAO produces some dramatically worse visuals, I think, making Leon and his surroundings here looking overly dark and not correct. CACAO can be a bit more expensive to run, but it is well worth that more minor cost. And it goes without saying, here the last setting to turn off is hair strands. Much like John and Oliver have mentioned in their reviews, it's only okay looking for the performance cost. I think it does look better on PC with better shading and more hair strands, but it is still not worth it for mid-range GPUs out there looking for a consistent 60 FPS. And there you have it. Here are my optimized settings. Really small cuts there for the big things that give the big wins, but importantly avoiding those less than flattering implementations of SSR and RT reflections. But if you care to ignore my recommendations for not using ray tracing, make sure to have the texture cache set to 2GB on an 8GB GPU to avoid crashing, and 3GB on a 10GB GPU. As a note here, I've only played the first 4.5 hours of the game to get this review out to you in good time, so I can only vouch for that. So if there is crashing that is occurring later in the game for some reason, well then I cannot speak to that. Now the absolute last thing I want to mention before I go is that the game will still have an occasional traversal hitch when you run across the game world, just as the demo does. Basically, there are invisible points in the world before each new section you go into that will trigger a rapid upload of data into your GPU's memory. It is done really rapidly and not gradually at all, and it causes what appears to be a CPU-related increase in frame time. This will manifest as a hitch on screen. The better your CPU is, the less you may notice this. And conversely, the higher your output frame rate is, like 120, the more obvious these hitches will become. As I said with the demo, I really wish the game did not have these, as it is otherwise shockingly smooth. Truly, if you ignore the crashing that can occur with ray tracing on, Resident Evil 4 is an astonishingly smooth experience on PC that feels great to play with a mouse and keyboard. There's no shader compilation stutter in sight in this game, but these occasional traversal hitches do break the otherwise flawlessly fluid experience. Thankfully though, they are spaced out enough in gameplay time and do not tend to occur near combat areas. The frequency is nothing like the hitching we saw in the Dead Space remake, which has them instead every few meters basically. With that being said, I'm at the end of this short and to the point video. The PC version of Resident Evil Remake 4 is good enough and fluid to play with the right settings, but Capcom still really needs to work on their PC porting efforts. Anti-aliasing needs to be way better. There needs to be DLSS here. The ray tracing quality needs to have higher presets that offer a good enough quality to make it worthwhile to use. And lastly, the game should never crash due to VRAM issues. Full stop. But that is enough from me for now. If you did like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to support more PC content like this, support us on Patreon. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?